Hey guys, this is EckhartsLadder. Hello and welcome to another episode of Star Wars Galactic Versus, the series where I take two factions, sometimes from the same universe, sometimes from different universes, sometimes even from the real world, put them together and try to predict which one would come out on top. Today we have one of my, if not my most requested matchup. We're looking at the Covenant Empire from the Halo series and putting it against the bad guys from the Star Wars series, the other empire, the Galactic Empire. I feature these two factions probably more than anyone else in these Versus series, so this should be an interesting one. And because I do feature these two so much, I thought it would be interesting because everyone is pretty familiar with them if we voted on the winner before I actually did my analysis. So take a second right now, vote in the upper right hand corner, and let me know who you think would win. Also, post down in the comments and tell me why you think would win, and if you want to post afterwards or edit your comment after I do my analysis, sure. If not, that's cool too. Before we get too far into the matchup, I just want to say something. I recently, and I guess just yesterday in the comments, soft launched my Patreon page, and I've decided now that YouTube is going to be a full-time thing for me, at least for a little while. So I'm at the point now where I feel comfortable asking you guys to support me if you want to. I also feel where YouTube ad revenue is completely unstable with, for example, the recent adpocalypse, and then the other day, well, just yesterday actually, I had one of my videos flagged for copyright and I totally lost all revenue, that I do need to find some alternate sources of revenue if I am going to do this for a full-time job, because I've got a family, I've got a house, and while this is super fun, right now it's not reliable enough. So if you guys do want to support me on my Patreon page where you can give a recurring monthly donation, follow the link down in the description. I'll also probably put it up on the screen right here. If you have any ideas for what you'd like for Patreon rewards, I'm still figuring that out, and the Patreon itself is still very raw. Let me know down in the comments or feel free to send me an email. Right now I don't have any formal rewards actually listed, but there will be some. I'll get that figured out within the next couple of days. Alright, so on to the actual battle. Because I think we're a bit more familiar with the Galactic Empire and the Covenant Empire than we are with most of our factions on this show, I'm going to take this episode a little bit differently. Instead of highlighting and focusing on each empire one by one, I'm going to look at several key categories, talking briefly about how I think the two stack up, and deciding whether one side has any serious advantage over the other. As for rules, we're just going to pretend, as we often do with these matchups, that the two factions and all of their resources are plopped down next to each other and they've got to fight it out until the death. That being said, we're looking at the factions, not the universes they inhabit. So, for example, the Halo rings will not be included in this matchup, although the Forerunner Dreadnought at the center of High Charity will be. So the first category of things that we're going to look at, and now that I'm doing this, it kind of reminds me of one of my old Starship Versus episodes that I haven't done for a while. So by the way, if you have any good suggestions for that, leave it down in the comments, and guys, upvote any really good ones. Sorry, totally off topic, but what I was saying, the very first category that we're looking at is Empire, the size of the Empire, the capabilities of the Empire, the civilian infrastructure, things like that. Let's start with the very basics, size. So we'll look first at the Galactic Empire. The galaxy in Star Wars is very, very large and very densely populated. Specifically, the Star Wars galaxy has a diameter of about 120,000 light years. That's larger than our actual galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, which has a galactic diameter of about 100,000 light years. Now, all of this territory could be attributed to the Galactic Empire, but I think that would be very disingenuous. While we know that the Galactic Empire exhibited a large degree of control over many planets within the galaxy, this wasn't true everywhere, and certainly, especially as you radiated away from the galactic core, Imperial control heavily diminished in places, and often quasi-governments or corporations controlled large portions of space. Star Wars Legends does actually give us some numbers, specifically that the government had tight control over 1 to 2 million worlds, with some control over dozens of millions of other colonies or small outposts. Still, an Imperial-controlled world is likely different than that of a Covenant-controlled world. Much of this does come down to fanaticism. With the Covenant, the worlds were probably happy to send most of their member species into the Covenant, no problem. In the Empire, the Imperials were doing more of a policing role and more of a government role. That being said, Covenant territory was minuscule when compared to that of the Galactic Empire. The Covenant existed primarily on the Orion arm of the Milky Way galaxy, and this is only about 10% of the galactic territory. Still, even this small amount of territory was not totally populated by the Covenant, and that's obvious given the fact that the UNSC before the war also existed in the Orion arm quite heavily. Another problem is that the species that actually made up the Covenant were much less propagated than humans, who made up most of the Empire, are in the Star Wars universe. The Covenant didn't heavily colonialize new worlds, there wasn't a continual stream of new species being added in, and in total they probably only had 100 to perhaps a couple of thousand established colonies. And this is really going to be a thread that will run throughout this entire matchup. The Empire is almost comically large, and although as I mentioned they don't exhibit the same degree of control over everyone within the Empire, they're just so big and they have so many soldiers. It's going to be very, very difficult for the Covenant to keep up. We've never really been given an exact number for either the Covenant Empire or the members of the Covenant Empire within the military, but just for reference, before the war, the UNSC had a population of approaching 40 billion. Obviously, we can't do a one-to-one comparison between that and the Covenant Empire, but even if the Covenant outnumber humanity 10-1, their population only approaches 400 billion. I mean, I still think that is quite drastically less than that of the Empire, and most likely drastically less than the active fighting force of the Empire. So really, in my opinion, the Covenant are going to need to have some major technological advantage to really win this battle. Either that, I guess, or they're far more militarized than their Imperial counterparts. So let's talk about that. Both Star Wars Legends and canon have put the number for Imperial Star Destroyers only, and that's not auxiliary ships, support ships, or dreadnoughts, at 25,000. And someone rightly pointed out the other day that the canon number does come from a mobile game, but still, I see no real reason to ignore what has been established. It does kind of make the small size at Endor a little bit unbelievable, but my headcanon has always been A, that of course there is plot armor, and B, that the Empire couldn't afford to move any more ships lest the Rebel Alliance notice the fleet movements and not spring the trap. Also, in both canon and Legends, we see that the Empire really was not defeated after the Battle of Endor. That was just when the New Republic was established. The Empire was along for much longer. Their forces were eventually whittled down through some fighting, both with the Republic and with Imperial splinter groups, but the military presence survived for a very, very long time. I don't necessarily think that there's anything that would suggest that the Covenant have a larger navy than that. The largest collection of Covenant ships ever seen is the fleet that protected High Charity, or rather, the collection of fleets that protected High Charity. I went over all the calculations for this in a previous video, but based on my estimates, this fleet had less than 1,000 ships. Alternatively, the Republic, which was significantly less militarized than the Empire, was able to produce thousands of ships for the Battle of Coruscant. Again, we're seeing what happens when a galactic spanning empire goes against one that has a sector presence. But let's continue. I guess the next question is Covenant technology, their warriors, or perhaps their leadership good enough to make up for this pretty serious size deficiency? The Covenant are clearly superior ground warriors. I mean, elites alone are incredible when you add brutes, which are so strong, and hunters, which are just also very powerful. You have the Covenant absolutely dominating the ground, although, again, there's a lot more Stormtroopers than there are elites. When you look at technology, the Covenant have some advantages, and they have some disadvantages. Going for them, they have artificial intelligence, which helps seriously with tactics and with weapons aiming, with slip space, everything else like that. Then you have the fact that personal energy shields are a lot more common, but that kind of goes back to the ground warrior thing. And then you have the fact that Covenant can do pinpoint slip space jumps. Now, this is possible within the Star Wars universe. We see Thrawn do that sometimes, but it seems like he needs help from Jorah Sabaoth, and it's not really something that's very common, and there are a lot of risks. The Covenant also most likely fight at longer ranges, and they do have a couple of exceptional ships. Most notably, I'd say the CSO class carriers and the CAS class carriers. They're very large and they output a lot of power. I will say though, otherwise I'm not convinced that the Covenant ships are much better than their Imperial counterparts. I mean, both seem to output similar levels of power. Of course, Star Wars Legends does have those crazy numbers, but when you look at things realistically, both are capable of glassing a planet. I think Covenant shielding technology is probably also not as impressive as that seen within Star Wars, but I'm not going to go heavily into that. All in all, I think while Covenant ships may be more impressive, they're not so much so that they completely dwarf what the Empire has, and that they make up for the size deficiency. Making matters worse is the fact that I think hyperspace is superior to slip space. It's faster, and with slip space, you have to stop periodically, especially when you have a lot of mass. This is what's known as reconciliation, and it will be somewhat of a burden in this case. Still, even at their max speed, Covenant ships typically max out at about 1,000 light years per day of travel. That is noticeably slower than Star Wars ships, which can cross the galaxy in several days with the case of the Millennium Falcon, and probably in about a month for some of the slower, some of the larger ships. Tech-wise for the Imperials, we also have several super weapons. Depending on exactly which era that we take, that would differ, but most likely the Death Star 1, the Death Star 2, perhaps some other secret projects. I don't think the Covenant really have answers for the large weapons like these, although they most likely could destroy them in straight-up assaults. Also on the Empire side is production capability. They unquestionably have more construction worlds, and we saw that they built the Death Star 2 in an extremely quick amount of time, although admittedly it wasn't finished, which really is just another benefit of being such a large empire. Finally, we have strategy, tactics, and leadership. This one is interesting because the Covenants in the Empire could not be more different. The Covenant is highly fanatical, but in the end is led by religious leaders. Still, Covenant warriors and Covenant shipmasters are very effective. Arguably, besides for the Grand Admirals of the Imperial military, I would say that Empire strategy and Empire tactics are on a lower level. That being said, these Grand Admirals could have exerted a lot of control over the Empire if they wanted. I mean, we saw after Palpatine's demise that Thrawn basically controlled the entire military himself, and I'm sure he would have taken a large role in a full-scale conflict. We also, of course, have Emperor Palpatine, and his foresight and, of course, his Force abilities provide a huge advantage. It should help them predict Covenant movements while also using things like battle meditation in any direct conflicts. So let's now talk about the battle, and this one I think is a little inherently unfair. We've got a galactic spanning empire going against the rather comparatively small Covenant. The Covenant are very fanatic and, especially with their religious motivations, they will never stop, but I think they are going to run into a brick wall here. They've got very impressive technology, and you know what, I wouldn't be surprised if one CCS class battlecruiser could take 1 or 2 Star Destroyers head to head. I'm not saying that that's necessarily what I think would happen, but I think that that's something you could argue. However, more realistically, a single CCS for the Covenant to be successful would have to take on 10 Star Destroyers. And yes, things like the use of Covenant AI, or the CSO class supercarrier, or even slip space jumping during battles will earn them some victories. However, every ship that they lose, and they will lose some, is going to be a devastating loss because their production output just will not match that of the Empire. When we add to that number disadvantage just the sheer power and intelligence of Palpatine, and then things like their super weapon and the effect that a loss of High Charity would have on the Covenant, I think it just becomes clear that in most situations, the Empire is going to take this battle. Are things impossible for the Covenant though? No. I mean, the Rebel Alliance won, and some of that was due to plot armor, but a large part of that was also due to the type of warfare they used. If the Covenant can use guerrilla tactics like they did, small surgical strikes, really spread the Empire out in their own galaxy, I think that could be successful. However, I will say that the Covenant, in my mind, is not quite as mobile as the Rebel Alliance is. They have established homeworlds, and although High Charity is quite easily moved, I just don't see them strategically using hit-and-run tactics, although admittedly, I might be biased because we've only really seen them in a war with humanity. Even if they do employ these tactics though, I think it is going to be very hard unless they borrow some of the Rebel Alliance's plot armor. Also problematic on their end is that the Covenant will not have a Jedi, they won't have sources within the Imperial hierarchy like the Rebel Alliance did, and they won't just know the Star Wars universe. I mean, the same is true for Star Wars when they're attacking the Covenant, but they can get past that just through sheer numbers. If it's not already clear the way I'm leaning, you haven't been paying attention, because I think it's pretty clear, just due to their sheer size and no crazy technological discrepancy, that the Empire takes this matchup, and I think they take it quite easily. So yes, I'll give it to the Star Wars universe. I think they win 9 times out of 10. The only way that the Covenant really have a chance is if they can do it like the Rebel Alliance did and make use of really a pretty big discrepancy in resources and also get lucky. But that's just my opinion. I know I said vote earlier, but you can still let me know down in the comments. Did you like this video? Did you think I did a good job? And of course, what would you like to see next? Give me your suggestions, guys. I'd like to do some Star Wars lore videos, perhaps a few top 5s. If you have any idea for those especially, let me know. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, guys. As always, this has been EckhartsLadder. May the Force be with you.